Welcome to Chapter 9. Today we return to the engine room of the GDPR and answer the question that begins every single processing decision. On what legal ground are we standing? Here's the plan. First, a focused refresher on the operating principles, fairness and lawfulness working together, purpose, limitation, and proportionality as the why and how much questions, accuracy and retention as ongoing disciplines, and integrity and confidentiality as the guardian principle. Then, the main event, the six lawful bases of Article 6, one by one. Consent, which you now know intimately from last chapter. Contractual necessity and its strict reading. Legal obligation and vital interests, the bases where the choice isn't really yours. And the final pair, public task for authorities and legitimate interests for everyone else, including the three-part balancing test that every privacy professional must be able to run in their sleep. Why does this chapter deserve its own space when we've touched principles before? Because choosing the wrong basis is the original sin of data protection. Everything downstream, your notices, your rights handling, your retention, inherits the error. Regulators know this, and so does the exam. By the end, you'll be able to look at any processing activity and name its proper legal home. Let's build that skill. Let's begin with the two principles that act as the conscience of every processing operation: lawfulness and fairness. They sound like twins, but they do different jobs, and mature privacy thinking uses both. Lawfulness is the formal test. Before any processing begins, one of the six Article 6 bases must apply, and you must identify it in advance, not reverse engineer it later. I've sat in meetings where a team launched a data project and asked afterward, so which basis should we say this was? That question, asked in that order, is the compliance failure itself. The basis is a foundation you build on, not a label you stick on. And lawfulness reaches beyond the GDPR too, processing that violates other laws, contract law, employment law, telecom rules, can't be lawful processing. Fairness is the substantive test, and it's the one that catches technically compliant schemes. It asks, would the person reasonably expect this? Are we deceiving anyone? Are we exploiting a power imbalance? Does this cause unjustified harm? Here's the pattern regulators keep punishing. Every individual step has a paper basis, yet the overall design misleads. Think of an app that technically discloses data sharing in Clause 47, while its interface promises privacy in bold letters. Lawfulish on paper, unfair in substance, and fairness wins that argument. Fairness also carries a protective streak for the vulnerable: children, employees, anyone whose choice is constrained. The greater the imbalance, the harder fairness looks at what you're doing. So build the two-question habit. What's our basis? And would the person nod if we explain this face to face? When both answers are solid, you're standing on rock. Now, the pair of principles that discipline ambition, purpose, limitation, and proportionality. Together, they force the two questions organizations least enjoy answering. Exactly why? And is this really needed? Purpose limitation first. Purposes must be specified, explicit, and legitimate, and defined before collection. Watch the enemy here: vagueness. Purposes like improving our services or business optimization sound reasonable and mean nothing. They fail the specificity test precisely because anything fits inside them. A well-specified purpose is falsifiable. Processing delivery addresses to fulfill orders tells you instantly what's in and out of scope. Then the second half, further use. New purposes must be compatible with the original ones, tested through the Article 6, Paragraph 4 factors: the link between old and new purposes, the collection context and the relationship, the nature of the data, especially if sensitive, the possible consequences for individuals, and the safeguards applied, like pseudonymization. And the law grants a standing presumption of compatibility to archiving in the public interest, scientific and historical research, and statistics, provided safeguards are in place. Fail the compatibility test, and the new purpose needs its own fresh basis. Proportionality then interrogates the means. Even for a legitimate purpose, the processing must be suitable and necessary, no bigger than the goal requires. Here's my favorite courtroom-style question for any project. Could we achieve this with less data, shorter retention, or fewer eyes? If yes, the current design is disproportionate by definition. A quick composite example from consulting life. A company wanted every employee's continuous location to secure one warehouse. Purpose? Fine. Means? Wildly oversized. Badge logs at the warehouse door achieved the goal with a fraction of the intrusion. That redesign conversation is proportionality in action, and you'll have it many times in your career. Let's revisit accuracy and retention, but this time as operational disciplines. The unglamorous habits that separate mature privacy programs from paper ones. Accuracy as a living duty. Data must be accurate and, where necessary for the purpose, kept up to date, with errors corrected or erased without delay. The phrase "where necessary" matters. A historical record of what address you had in 2020 is not inaccurate for being old, it's accurate history. The question is whether the purpose demands currency. A marketing preference from 5 years ago? Probably stale. A record of a transaction? Permanently accurate as a record. And crucially, when corrections happen, they must propagate to downstream systems and, as Article 19 taught us, to recipients. An organization that fixes its CRM but not its data warehouse hasn't fixed anything. Now, retention. And let's diagnose why organizations struggle so predictably here. Storage is cheap, deletion feels irreversible, and no single team owns the problem. So data accumulates like sediment. The GDPR's answer is the retention schedule, a documented table saying for each category of data how long we keep it and why. Payroll records held for the period tax law requires. Unsuccessful candidate CVS for a short window unless consent extends it. CCTV for days, not years. The schedule turns a vague principle into checkable rules, and regulators ask for it by name. Two closing tips from the field. First, deletion needs engineering. Build purge routines and test them. A policy without a mechanism is a wish. Second, when business teams resist, reframe the risk. Every record kept past its purpose is discovery material in litigation, breach exposure in an incident, and a fine multiplier in enforcement. Old data isn't an asset, it's rent you pay in risk. Let's give the security principle its moment as a principle. Because Chapter 5 covered the machinery, and today I want the mindset. The words first. Personal data must be processed in a manner ensuring appropriate security, including protection against unauthorized or unlawful processing and against accidental loss, destruction, or damage, using appropriate technical or organizational measures. Notice how broad the threat model is. Not just hackers, accidents, not just theft, damage, and loss. The principle guards against the malicious outsider, the careless insider, and plain bad luck equally. Here's the mindset shift I coach. Security in the GDPR is not an IT department's private problem. It's a processing principle, which means it applies to every activity, every team, every scrap of personal data. The HR manager emailing a spreadsheet, the receptionist with a visitor log, the marketer exporting a customer list to a personal drive, each is either upholding or breaching this principle in the moment. And confidentiality has an inward-facing edge people underestimate. Unauthorized includes your own staff exceeding their need to know. The support agent browsing a celebrity customer's account out of curiosity is a confidentiality breach. No external attacker required. Real cases of exactly this have ended careers and triggered enforcement. Least privilege, access logging, and a culture where snooping is unthinkable. That's the principle operating internally. Remember also that security scales with risk, echoing Article 32, and that failures here have a distinctive quality. They're visible. Principles like purpose limitation fail quietly. Security fails in headlines. That's why, when you examine the largest fines on record, an integrity and confidentiality failure so often sits at the center. Guard the data like the principle it is. Now, to the six bases. We open the six bases with the most famous and most misused of them all: consent. You mastered its validity conditions in Chapter 8, so today's question is strategic. When should consent be your basis at all? Here's the principle that reframes everything. The six bases are equal. No hierarchy exists. Consent is not the default, not the gold standard, not extra safe. It's one tool among six, and like any tool, brilliant for some jobs and wrong for others. When does consent shine? When the processing is genuinely optional and the individual holds real power to say no without losing anything they need. Newsletter subscriptions, optional profiling for recommendations, non-essential cookies, sharing data with partners for perks. In these settings, consent honors autonomy beautifully. The person rules their own extras. When does consent fail? Two patterns. First, power imbalance. An employer asking employees to consent is almost always collecting fiction. Refusing your boss is not a free choice, which is why regulators treat employment consent as invalid except in rare no-detriment corners. Public authorities face similar skepticism. Second, false choice, where the processing will happen regardless. If you'd process the data anyway under a legal duty, asking for consent is worse than pointless. It's misleading because withdrawal must mean something, and here it couldn't. That's the strategic trap. Remember it from last chapter. Consent is the only basis the individual can revoke at will. Build a critical process on it, and you've handed everyone a stop button. Then comes the forbidden move, quietly switching to legitimate interests when consents evaporate. Regulators read that as an admission the consent was decorative. So the professional's question is never, can we get consent? It's, is consent the honest description of this relationship? If yes, collect it impeccably. If no, keep reading. 5 better fitting bases follow. Basis number 2, contractual necessity, the quiet workhorse behind most everyday commerce. Every online order, every subscription, every ride-hail trip runs largely on this basis, and yet it's also home to one of the EDPB's sternest interpretations. The text covers two situations: processing necessary for the performance of a contract with the data subject, and processing necessary for pre-contractual steps taken at the data subject's request. Think a quote or a credit check you asked for before signing. The everyday logic is friendly. You order a jacket online. The shop processes your address because how else does the jacket find you? Your payment details because the contract involves paying. Your email for the order confirmation. All plainly necessary to perform the contract you chose. No consent banners needed for the core transaction. The contract itself carries the processing. But now the strict part, and the exam loves this edge. Necessary means objectively necessary. The contract genuinely cannot be performed without this processing. It does not mean useful, profitable, or mentioned in the terms. Writing a clause into your contract saying the customer agrees to profiling for advertising does not transform advertising into contractual necessity. The EDPB drew this line sharply in its guidance on online services, and Ireland's headline enforcement against large platforms turned exactly on this. Personalized advertising, the regulators concluded, is not necessary to deliver a social network, whatever the terms of service claim. Here's your practical test. I call it the counterfactual. Strip out the processing and ask, does the service the person actually signed up for still function? Jacket without address? Impossible. Necessity confirmed. Social feed without behavioral ad profiling? Works fine. Necessity denied. Find another basis. One boundary note. The contract must be with the data subject themselves. Processing an employee's data to perform your contract with their employer doesn't fit here. That scenario shops among the other bases, usually legitimate interests. Now, two bases united by a theme: the absence of choice. With legal obligation, the law commands you. With vital interests, life itself does. Legal obligation first. This basis applies when processing is necessary to comply with a legal obligation to which the controller is subject under EU or member state law. The examples surround every business. Employers report salary data to tax authorities because tax law says so. Banks verify identities and retain records because anti-money laundering statutes demand it. Airlines share passenger data where legislation requires. In each case, notice the structure. The law itself defines the purpose and largely the scope. The controller isn't choosing to process, it's obeying. Two clarifications keep this basis clean. First, the obligation must be a genuine legal one from legislation. A contractual promise to a business partner is not a legal obligation in this sense, however binding it feels. That's legitimate interest territory. Second, the obligation must compel the processing with reasonable clarity. A vague sense that regulators would like this doesn't qualify. And a practical note for your notices. When you rely on this basis, name the law. Transparency means citing the actual obligation, not murmuring legal reasons. Vital interests is the emergency basis. Processing necessary to protect the vital interests of the data subject or another person, essentially life and physical integrity. Picture the unconscious patient wheeled into an emergency room. Doctors access medical records with no consent possible, and the law smiles on it. Or disclosing someone's location during a natural disaster rescue. The doctrine keeps it narrow. This is a last resort basis. The recitals indicate it applies where processing cannot be based on another ground, and once the person can consent or another basis fits, vital interests recedes. It's the basis you hope never to use and are grateful exists. We arrive at the final pair, and one of them will dominate your professional life. Let's take them in turn. Public task first. Article 6(1)(e). Processing necessary for the performance of a task carried out in the public interest or in the exercise of official authority. This is the natural home of governance. A municipality maintaining electoral rolls, a licensing authority processing applications, a public health agency running screening programs. The task must be grounded in law. The basis doesn't float free. It borrows legitimacy from a legal mandate. And here's the exam-tested corollary. Public authorities cannot rely on legitimate interests for processing performed in their public tasks. The legislature made their basis for them, keeping public power on statutory rails. Now, legitimate interests, Article 6(1)(f), the most flexible basis and therefore the one demanding the most discipline. Processing necessary for the legitimate interests of the controller or a third party, except where overridden by the interests or fundamental rights of the data subject, with special vigilance where the data subject is a child. The method is the three-part test, and I want it living in your reflexes. 1. Purpose. Is the interest legitimate, real, and articulated? Fraud prevention, network security, direct marketing, all recognized candidates. Recital 47 even names marketing as a possible legitimate interest. 2. Necessity. Is this processing genuinely needed for that interest, or would something less intrusive do? 3. Balancing. Weigh your interest against the individual's rights and, crucially, their reasonable expectations. Would this person be surprised? A customer expects fraud checks on their payment. They don't expect their data sold to brokers. Expectation is the fulcrum. Document the whole exercise as a legitimate interests assessment, an LIA. It's your accountability evidence and regulators requested by name. And never forget the counterweight. Individuals hold the Article 21 objection right against this basis. The balance can be rerun at their demand. 6 bases, 1 decision. Choose deliberately, document honestly, and the rest of your compliance inherits solid ground. Tremendous work. Chapter 9 complete, and you've just conquered the decision that defines every privacy program. You can now hold any processing activity up to the light and name its proper basis, run the legitimate interest balancing test, spot false contractual necessity, and know when consent honors people versus when it deceives them. That's the analytical core of the entire certification, and you own it now. Our quick ritual before moving on. If this course keeps proving useful, subscribe to the channel. That single click opens up this playlist plus all our other certification playlists, and it tells us to keep producing free structured training for this community. Hold the sequence too. Chapter 10 takes today's foundations straight into advanced territory, the special category gateways of Article 9 layered on top of the bases you just learned, plus the transparency machinery of privacy notices. You'll see immediately why basis first thinking had to come today. And when you're ready to convert understanding into exam performance, our complete CIPP/E course on Udemy is built exactly for that. Chapter quizzes after every section, full-length practice tests that mirror real exam pressure, role-play scenarios like defending an LIA to a skeptical regulator, and downloadable toolkits for your final revision weeks. The link is right there in the description. Take a breather, and here's your self-test for the walk to the kitchen. Name all 6 bases from memory and 1 example each. Then meet me in Chapter 10. See you there.